Welcome to episode 101 of The Route, presented by White Whale Marketing. The Route is a glorified sports business coffee chat. There's a new guest every episode as they share their experiences and route in sports. I'm Christopher Nascimento, and let's get started. As always, just a few things to cover. First off, if you haven't already, check us out on social media at The Route Sports. If you're watching us on YouTube here, you can see at the top corner at The Route Sports. So that's LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that good stuff there. And obviously, if you're listening to this, maybe you're interested in growing your network. Maybe it's even just starting your network. So it's a great way to maybe connect with guests or connect with me or anything like that. So check us out there. Also, if you're listening to this, please subscribe or follow to the podcast. So that's on, Apple, Google, Spotify, and we're on YouTube as well under the White Whale Marketing YouTube channel. So check us out there, subscribe, follow, like, rate 5 stars, all that good stuff. Leave a comment, just allows us to continue growing. And that way we continue doing this for years to come. And last but not least, before we get into today's guest, just a quick little message from BetStamp. So if you're someone like me, during the sports season, you like to place a couple bucks on, your favorite team, right? So I'll have buddies over watching a game. I'll do a quick little live bet. And as soon as that bet goes through, I'll have a friend tell me their odds, or even I'll see the TSM, for example, share what their partner's odds are. And right away, I'm like, damn, I didn't get the best odds. And that always sucks, right? So the solution to that is to use BetStamp to compare the best available odds among sports books. The only way you're going to get an edge in online sports betting is by having an account with multiple sports books. So if you download the BetStamp app or go to betstamp.app/Ontario and use the code WHALE, you can get access to their affiliates and their prices. BetStamp allows you to verify the existence of a proposed bet with the corresponding odds. This provides you to buy and sell picks with full transparency. Users selling sports picks on BetStamp do not sacrifice any royalty or cut to the app. It's completely free, which is always good stuff. So again, if you want an edge in sports betting, use BetStamp by downloading their app or visiting betstamp.app/Ontario and using the code WHALE to get access to all of their affiliates and their pricing. With that, we now have one of their affiliates who is joining us now. So I'd now like to welcome a leader in the Canadian sports betting market, having previously founded his own in-game fantasy platform and being the former president of the third largest daily fantasy sports operator in the U.S. Employee number 1 at PointsBet, the chief commercial officer, Nic Sulsky. Welcome to The Route. How's it going?
Hey, it's going great, Christopher. Thanks for having me. And BetStamp is a great site, and it works the best when you're using it in conjunction with PointsBet, of course.
Of course. No, I've definitely had, I've had a couple of bets myself where as soon as I did it, like I was saying, it goes through and says, oh, shit, right? Like, I should use PointsBet or something like that, right? Because you're just doing something quick. So, yeah.
There you go.
But we can talk about that further as we get into today's episode. But for now, the way I like to start every episode, take us through your route. So where did it begin? Maybe, where did your career start? If you went to school, like how did that begin? How did you get to the position we're at
now? Christopher, I will say that my route is a little bit unconventional from where I'm at right now, being an operator in the iGaming space in Canada. So I guess you started like where did I go to school? So I went to university in Mount Allison in Sackville, New Brunswick. Played rugby there. I studied history and religious studies, which is the obvious path that you're gonna start with when you're gonna become an iGaming operator. Now after university, literally this summer after I graduated, I played in something called the Maccabea Games. Now the Maccabea Games, for those of your audience that don't know, which is about 97% of people, the Maccabea Games is actually the third biggest sporting event in the world from an athlete participation perspective. It's the Jewish Olympics, and it happens every 4 years in Israel. I am Jewish, which I know is going to come as a big surprise to you and most of your listeners. So I went to Israel to play in the Maccabea Games after university, and I ended up becoming pretty good friends with the Australian rugby team there. Now, my initial idea or life path was law school. I was going to go to law school and do and kind of go down that road. But ultimately, after playing in the Maccabee Games, I decided that I wanted to take some time before actually jumping down that road. And the great folks from the Australian team and the coach of that team asked me if I was interested in going to Australia and playing rugby with them. Made sense to me. I just graduated from school. I'd never been to Australia. The idea of a year off and an excuse to take that year off made it a little bit easier to explain to my parents and my family why I wasn't going right to grad school or law school. And so I ended up going to Australia to play rugby. And after about 3 weeks, I realized that being a good Canadian rugby player means that you're a pretty shitty Australian rugby player. So, the idea of spending a year being on like the third team of a rugby club didn't really appeal to me. So I ended up just becoming like a backpacker in Australia. And for anyone that's ever been to Australia, I mean, that was a long time ago. I'm old. So about 25 years ago, when you were backpacking around Australia, it was just an incredible kind of framework to travel around the country and meet people and work and stuff. Anyway, I spent over a year in Australia, and at that point, I still wasn't quite ready to go to law school. So I was kind of the one constant of mine. I've moved around a lot. I've moved to a couple different places when I was a kid, but the one constant in my life was a place called Mont Tremblant. Mont Tremblant is about an hour and a half or an hour, just under an hour and a half north of Montreal, a couple hours from Ottawa. And I spent a year working and living in Mont Tremblant. Still just trying to kind of figure out when and what kind of postgraduate degree I was going to get. At that point, I wasn't sure. I still wanted to go to law school. And, fast forward through that year, I decided that I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to get into film and television. When you study history and religious studies, the one thing that you get used to doing is writing and thinking. And I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I will acknowledge at that point, living in Australia for a year and then living in Tremblant for a year after going to school at Mount Allison University, I will say that smoking the occasional foreign or the occasional cannabis product was not foreign to me, I should say. So being a writer and wanting to get into film and television really wasn't that big of a surprise to my parents and to a lot of folks. And I ended up actually leaving Tremblant. I got an internship program to work in Ottawa at a place called the Canadian Screen Training Center. Lived in Ottawa for a year while I was working there. And at that point, I'd met some pretty interesting people, and I came up with a concept for a television show in the children's realm. So ultimately, I went from wanting to be a lawyer to being a dedicated producer or creator of children's television shows. So I'll skip through kind of the why and the how, but I was able to convince the Family Channel at the time, who was looking for a new kind of brand, a new concept to rebrand the Family Channel. And I'd pitched a bunch of Canadian television broadcasters, a television show concept that I came up with. And, I was like 24. I had put together this concept for a show, but none of them bought it, but they liked, they liked the idea. They liked the energy that I brought to the table. And the Family Channel was looking for somebody to kind of reinvigorate their network. And they gave me an opportunity to pitch them a show, and they bought it. And I ultimately became the face of the Family Channel in Canada. I produced, directed, and hosted my own kids' television show. And that's really where my professional career started in Canada, being a Canadian children's television host and producer. So that's that. And that was 2002 and 2003. So there, I jumped from graduating university and playing in the Maccabee Games in 97 to being a children's television producer in the early 2000s. So Christopher, I'm happy to keep telling you the story if you want to. You
No,
want to
no,
dive in any deeper on any of that stuff?
Let's get into it. That's what the whole point of the podcast is.
All right, man. So here, I'll tell you what the show was. It was funny. So, and this was before YouTube. So these clips don't actually exist. That's, again, I'm old. So it was me and these two kind of humanoid puppets. We took a jar of water. We took a jar of water from the Atlantic Ocean, and we drove across Canada to the Pacific Ocean to pour the water in to see what would happen. And so if you can imagine six mid-20-year-old guys in a motorhome driving literally across the Trans-Canada Highway in a month, shooting a television show, asking kids and celebrities and people what they thought would happen when we poured the water from the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. That was the show. It was called The Family Experiment. And then we did the second season of the show was called The Family Expedition, where we chased a Sasquatch around the country. So I've had the great pleasure of literally seeing almost I've driven every inch of the Trans-Canada Highway. I've been to every province. I unfortunately haven't been to either territory yet, or any of the three territories yet. But it gave me an incredible kind of snapshot of how remarkable this country is. But around that time, there was, and here comes the pathway into sports. So around that time, you're young, so you may not remember this show, but there was a show on TSN called Off the Record that was hosted by a guy by the name of Michael Landsberg. So, and that was like the biggest sports talk show in this country for years and years and years. So back in 2000 and I want to say it was 2003, 2002, 2003, the format of that show was Michael was the host, and every day or 4 days a week, Monday to Thursday, he would have a panel of 4 guests on his show, and they would talk about the topics of the day, right? And he would have ex-athletes, coaches, sports people, media people, but he would also have like B and C, and in my case, well, eventually like D-level celebrities on the show, right? So one day I literally just emailed the producer of Off the Record and I said, hey, listen, he was reading. That doesn't really make sense. But I sent an email to the producer and I told him that I was on television. I was hosting my own television show and I played rugby for Canada, and I'd love to, and I can talk about sports, and I'd love to be on your show. Now, I didn't tell him at the time that I played for the Jewish Canadian team, but hey, if you wore the maple leaf on your chest, and which I did, I played it up as much as I could. And so they finally agreed, and they let me do the show. And so my very first episode of Off the Record, I remember it vividly. And I have told this story before, but it's pretty funny. The very first show I did happened to be the day after the 10-year anniversary of the Blue Jays, second World Series or first World Series. It was I guess 2003 makes sense. And Candy Maldonado was on the show with me at the same time, who was a member of those Blue Jays World Championship teams. And he was still, either he was still drunk or he was still very happy, put it that way. I don't know if he was in talk, but anyway. So my very first experience on Off the Record was with a still happy Candy Maldonado, which was pretty exciting. So I did that show once, and it was super fun. And I ended up doing the show a second time, probably like 4 or 5 months later. And then the producer of the show at that point said to me, "Listen, like you're not shy. You're keen to engage with other guests and debate topics, because let's face it, the point of that show was having an interesting conversation, and I wasn't shy about taking the opposite angle of a debate, because ultimately it's all about creating fun content, and I didn't give a shit if I was supporting steroids in sports. Like, yes, I'm not a big fan of steroids, but from a sports fan perspective, hey, I wouldn't mind seeing a 600-foot home run, right? I wouldn't mind seeing a guy run a 4.1 40-yard dash. Like, hey, that's kind of cool as a fan. I don't believe that steroids are a good thing in sports, but that was my angle, right? Anyway, the producer at the time said, listen, you're pretty good. What we like to have is like, 6 or 7, what they call like fighters, people that they could bring onto the show when there's an important or a very well-to-do guest who can help Michael drive conversation hard out of them. And so they asked me if I'd be open to being one of those kind of fighters, one of those, they call them guarantees, meaning a guaranteed guest that can keep the conversation going. And I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Super fun. So I started doing the show a little bit more frequently. And this was around the time when I started really getting involved in season-long fantasy sports. Now, fantasy sports, fantasy football, fantasy hockey, fantasy basketball, fantasy baseball. At that time, it was starting to get pretty big. And now I'll say, season-long fantasy sports is the biggest social game that's ever been invented, right? For your audience, season-long fantasy sports, you get together with 10 or 12 or whatever, 16 of your friends. Yeah, before a season begins, you draft a bunch of players from teams in the league that you're interested in, and then you would score points based on how those players do on the field, right? And then you can trade players. So it's effectively you're like your own general manager. And I was getting really into fantasy football at the time, but this was like before fantasy sports content really exploded. And it just so happened that the producer of Off the Record at that point was also a big fantasy sports guy. And so we just started talking about, man, like there is not a lot of fantasy content out there. And so we thought, man, it'd be really cool if we could maybe create a fantasy sports show. And what was interesting about Off the Record at the time is Off the Record, they were shooting at this point down at the time it was still called the Sky Dome, and hell, I still call the Rogers Center the Sky Dome. I mean, shit, Sky Dome. So it was down at the Sky Dome, and the crew was called for 2 hours, and the shoot Off the Record literally lasts about an hour. So they're paying this crew for 2 hours. The Off the Record was only an hour, and so the producer and I were like, well, the crew is here. Like, what if we were to pitch the executives at TSN? Like, let's do this fantasy sports show. Let's test it out. We'll use the crew. And hey, what's the, it's not like there's a lot of expense there. So we convinced the TSN executive to let us give this a go. It was called the Fantasy Hockey Report. We brought in Scott Cullen, who at the time was the head of TSN's kind of fantasy content. And Scott and I ended up co-hosting. I mean, I was the host and Scott was the smart guy. The Fantasy Hockey Report, which was the first broadband, like the first online fantasy sports show, was on tsn.ca. So we did the first season down at the Sky Dome. We did the second season of the show up at TSN in the Fishbowl, like where Sports Center in Scarborough, where it's actually filmed, which is pretty cool. So we did that for a couple of years. But then I really started thinking about, and at this point, I was like still making content and trying to do TV shows. And I was doing a bunch of like branded content for like Puma and Molson, just really trying to have some fun. And, this was right around the time, I should say, I really started thinking about the convergence of fantasy sports, which was one of my favorite hobbies, and media, right? Which I was working in. And this was around the time phones started really blowing up and people really started talking about what we call like second screen companion experiences, right? The great thing about live sports, or the great thing about sports, is people watch it live, right? You can't watch it on tape delay, And so there's an opportunity to engage a live audience that doesn't exist in conjunction with other content, right? It's hard to think about a movie and like, oh, I'm going to create a really cool experience in conjunction with this movie because everybody watches movies at their own time, at their own pace, right? So, sports, award shows, and elections, right? Now, reality television shows to a certain degree that are live have a degree of real-time engagement opportunity. So, I kept thinking about like, how do you make the experience of live sports better? Which has really been the through line of my career since I moved on from children's television shows and puppets. So, fantasy sports became kind of a natural. So I came up with a concept and created and founded my first company called InGamer, which we built in 2008, 2009, we built in 2008, launched 2009, 2010-ish. And it was a real-time, free-to-play fantasy sports game that you would play in conjunction with a live sporting event. So as an example, we built the product, raised a little bit of angel money. We were incubated in a place called Mars. Now, Mars is a provincially funded kind of tech incubator in downtown Toronto, which was incredible getting into that program and really learning how to build business the right way. But ultimately, what InGamer was, as a direct example, our first partnership we licensed our product to CBC, and we were the partner of Hockey Night in Canada. Mm-hmm. And the product for Hockey Night in Canada was called the Crown Royal Star Selector. Crown Royal was the sponsor of the product. Yeah. And what you would do is you would pick 5 players before the Hockey Night in Canada game. So you'd pick 5 players in the game. You'd score points based on how those players would do. But then you could change your players for each period, which was pretty cool. It had never been done before. We were pretty early, right? And it was a really exciting experience. But I will say, it failed ultimately. I think it failed for a couple of reasons. It failed, we licensed it to CBC, we licensed it to Rogers, licensed it to the Toronto Star. It failed, one, because hockey went on lockout, in the early 2010s, as you'll probably remember. And when you're building a Canadian tech business and you lose the core revenue driving sport that your business is based on, obviously that's an issue. But the real reason why it ultimately failed was the business model was flawed. We built the business reliant on license fees, on sponsorship fees. And the reality is, when you're dealing with media companies, it's all about revenue and eyeballs, right? And they want to sell all products to sponsors. Well, it becomes a vicious circle, right? For a media company to generate revenue off of a product or off of a piece of content, they need to be able to sell sponsors to get behind, whether it's a digital product or whether it's a television show or whatever. The sponsors want eyeballs. So as you're a startup and you're building something, the reality is, unless you're a startup or unless you have built a product and you have runway for a couple years to prove that there's going to be eyeballs, it's very difficult to convince both media companies and sponsors to get behind it, because ultimately you're starting from scratch at the beginning. So you can convince somebody to take a chance, but the reality is it becomes a very vicious chicken and egg circle, because ultimately, in order for a sponsor to be ecstatic over an activation, the eyeballs that's going to make them ecstatic takes time and energy to build. So it becomes really challenging when you're not going direct to consumer to generate any kind of revenue. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, for sure makes sense.
Yeah, so I learned that really early on. And again, like, InGamer was a free-to-play game. And, InGamer was really starting to grow 2011, 2012. And then, of course, I believe it was 2013 is when the hockey lockout happened, which really hurt InGamer. But this was right around the time when something called daily fantasy sports started to grow in the US. Now, I described what season-long fantasy sports was. Now, daily fantasy sports is something very similar, but instead of playing it with your friends, you're playing it against kind of random people. And instead of playing a game over an entire season, well, because of the name, daily fantasy sports is played in one day. And so there were a couple companies at the time in 2013, 2014 that started really exploding. FanDuel was one of them. A company called Draft Street, which eventually morphed into DraftKings, were obviously the leaders at that point. But there were a dozen daily fantasy sports companies back then. And the industry was starting to explode, because the reality is daily fantasy sports is as close to sports betting as you can get without crossing the line, right? We don't get into the nuance of how daily fantasy sports is a legal game of skill and all of that. But let's just say it is. And it is legal, and it was legal in the US. And so, daily fantasy sports was working because it capitalized on the popularity of season-long fantasy sports And it also allowed media companies and other brands to get involved in fantasy without risking all that much, because the daily fantasy sports companies were making money. They were making revenue on the contests they were offering to users. But daily fantasy sports was built, grew, and exploded because of one reason only. Because everybody, or a lot of people, believed that eventually sports betting was going to be legalized. Daily fantasy sports was a way to build a database of users in preparation for the eventual legalization of sports betting. Yeah. Because daily fantasy sports was never a revenue maker. It was a money loser. Every company lost a lot of money in daily fantasy sports. We don't need to get into the dynamics of how the business model of daily fantasy sports was candidly flawed. But ultimately, it was all about the long-term play of building out these databases that eventually would be able to be transitioned into sports betting and online casino, which is also part of kind of the iGaming world, because it would be a lot cheaper to acquire those customers via daily fantasy sports than it would be via sports betting when it was legalized.
Yeah.
So this was back in 2015, or in 2014, I should say. I ended up joining a European regulated gambling company who was working with casinos and other licensed North American gaming operators in the horse racing industry. And they saw the growth of daily fantasy sports. They saw it was coming. All of these licensed regulated gaming operators were like casino operators were like, man, we want to get involved in this daily fantasy sports thing because eventually sports gambling is going to be legal and we want those databases. But none of them could do it because they didn't want to jeopardize their gambling licenses. Because daily fantasy sports was always a little bit gray, right? Like people are like, is it legal? Isn't it legal? Like not every state let it. So no regulated gaming operator, no casino operator wanted to touch it because ultimately for those folks, their most valuable asset is their license. Without a license, you can't operate a casino, right? So this European regulated gaming operator was trying to figure out how to get involved in the North American daily fantasy sports market, or effectively the US daily fantasy sports market. So they brought me in to help figure out the strategy. Then I put together a deal that I architected between that company and a New York-based marketing company. And then in September of 2015, we bought a company called Draft Day, which was at that point the third or fourth biggest daily fantasy sports company in the US. We called it the Draft Day Gaming Group. And the way we got this deal done was by pivoting the direct-to-consumer business model to a B2B white label approach that we would then go to the casino operators and say, hey, you guys want to be a part of daily fantasy sports. You can't jeopardize your licenses. So we're going to be the operator. We're going to give you a white label, Casino X Daily Fantasy Sports. So they're not jeopardizing their gaming licenses because we're the operators. They're effectively just a marketing partner, but it would give them access to the database, right? So we bought this company. We had put this deal together to onboard like 9 of the biggest casino operators in the US. The deal closed the third week of September of 2015. I became the president of Draft Day Gaming Group based in New York. And then early October of 2015, literally 3 weeks after acquiring Draft Day, a massive scandal hit the daily fantasy sports industry in New York. And the New York Attorney General came out and said that daily fantasy sports was illegal. It was an illegal form of gambling, and basically shuttered the entire daily fantasy sports market in New York, which obviously had a ripple effect across all of the regulated gaming operators the casino operators that we had spoken to. So here we are, just bought this company, and we had this whole new business plan, all new business strategy. And then all of a sudden, kabam, it blows up 3 weeks after we do this deal. Like, talk about clusterfuck, right? And something you don't really plan for, right? But I mean, I've learned throughout my life and throughout my career that startup and business, you can make the best plans, but ultimately, sometimes, a lot of times, things happen out of your control, and you're like, well, shit, right? So that was a bit of a shocker. But what that did was, so, the result of that was we started looking at other industries and other markets that might be potential partners of this new B2B business that we had just built. And Christopher, by all means, cut me off all the time.
No. This is great.
Lot, man.
Literally, every time I'm thinking of a question, you're answering it. So this is perfect.
Yeah, I could just keep going, man. I'm
this is
I'm
what
not even all that. I'm not even all
that.
that caffeinated, to be honest.
Yeah.
So the two areas that we looked at, well, we tried to figure out what are some potential what are some potential options to keep this business moving. One was other markets, other partners that had databases that might be complementary to daily fantasy sports, and the other was other territories. So from another territories perspective, ended up meeting some great folks in Australia who operated a digital division of Crown Resorts. Crown Resorts being a massive casino company in Australia. They had a digital business called PointsBet, and they were looking at launching a daily fantasy sports site in Australia called Draft Stars. So we ended up doing a big deal with PointsBet, and Draft Day Gaming Group ended up powering Draft Stars, which ended up becoming like the biggest daily fantasy sports platform in Australia, which is ironic because, fast forward, the head of finance for Draft Stars is the current head of finance for PointsBet in the US, because PointsBet is an Australian-funded company from Melbourne, which is where PointsBet was from. So I've been in connection with some of the Australian gaming world for a long time. But anyway, then the other segment, the other database that we started really looking at was adult entertainment, right? When you think about online, when you think about people putting their credit card down online, adult is another segment of the population that, you kind of you correlate to that. So I ended up building a relationship with a gentleman who ran a company called Vivid Entertainment, which was one of the biggest adult kind of content distributors and deal makers on the planet. And it's funny because we had done a deal, Draft Day had done a deal with Vivid Entertainment prior to us acquiring it. And then by the time we finally got around to launching something, the board of the company that I worked, the board of the European gaming company, decided they didn't like the adult entertainment piece. And it was funny. I remember like the call that I got from them as we were about to launch the business with Vivid, because they were an English gambling company, but they thought they were family friendly, so they couldn't do anything with the adult world, which I found was a bit of a paradox. But anyway, so Draft Day, the Draft Day Gaming Group really existed on the backside of, no pun intended, of Draft Stars, which was the Australian daily fantasy sports company. And then, after a couple of years, I started, or by 2016, 2017, I was getting a little bit antsy. I'm an entrepreneur. I like building product. And I had created a really strong relationship with the guy who owned and built Vivid Entertainment. And by 2017, it became really, really obvious. A couple things became obvious to us about the daily fantasy sports industry. Now, one was that a vast majority of the money was won by a tiny percentage of the users. Daily fantasy sports effectively became an operation that serviced sharp users, people that were using math algorithms and scripts to effectively take money from casual users. 98% of the money was won by like 2% of the users. That's a shitty experience, right? And I got into the business because daily fantasy sports was fun. Well, the way that the business evolved, basically FanDuel and DraftKings, and they were the two biggies, they effectively built their daily fantasy sports businesses to service their whales, to service their high quality users, basically funneling money from the casual users to the sharp gamers. Now, that was a real, I thought, we both thought that was a big challenge. And daily fantasy sports, the conventional version of daily fantasy sports, was a little bit complicated, right? You're picking 8 or 9 players from a specific day across all the different sports or all different games that are going on. You're trying to deal with all the stats, and it was a lot of thought, a lot of time went into building. Now, like building your lineups that you would use to enter these contests. So we just, we kept talking about like, and also there wasn't really a definable brand in the daily fantasy sports industry, right? They were fan this, pick this, they're all kind of the same thing, right? So Bill and I started, his name is Bill Asher. Bill and I started talking a lot about like, is there innovation here? And so we decided, we agreed that there were kind of, the industry was ripe for 2 types of innovations. One was a brand, right? We were like, and here's Bill built and marketed and grew one of the biggest brands in the history of the internet, right? So here's this guy, this genius who had, built an online brand. And so I was like, man, that would be incredible to work with him. And then from a product perspective, we identified an area that we could really lean into, which we kind of invented around single player daily fantasy sports. So instead of playing against sharks, you were kind of playing against yourself, right? Which made it a lot easier and a little bit more casual for people to latch onto. So we started talking, and then eventually I left Draft Day and I joined forces with Bill. And in July of 2017, we started building what would become the 3rd biggest daily fantasy sports site in North America, called Monkey Knife Fight. So Monkey Knife Fight, as you can tell, cool brand. Here's a bobblehead from back in the day. I mean, not that long ago. Yeah, but really, Monkey Knife Fight was based around giving users an ability to, it was really about giving the user an ability to really lean into the single game that they were watching. So you could pick 2 players up to 7 players in an individual game, and you would pick, whether a player would go. I mean, we had a bunch of different game types, but our most popular was what we called over under, or more or less. And you would pick, whether an individual player would perform more or less than a specific stat that you would predict, right? So it was, and if you got 2 or more, if you got your predictions right, you would win. Super easy to understand, a lot easier to pick up and understand from a casual sports fan, and it worked, right? And so we launched Monkey Knife Fight officially. We started building it in 2017, but we tested and iterated and tried to figure out what was going to be the right products and the right name and the right branding. We effectively launched Monkey Knife Fight in September of 2018. And yeah, it was a whirlwind, man. We were still only 6 full-time people, and really by the end of November, everything just started exploding. And through the Super Bowl, Bill and I have made this joke a lot of times. It was like drinking from a fire hose. Like it was crazy. People loved the product, people liked the brand, and people just started playing a lot. And, Bill, who was a wealthy entrepreneur, had invested the money to get us going at that point. So here we are, end of Super Bowl of 2019. So we're talking end of January, early February of 2019. And we were like, all right, we got something here. And then Bill decided to invest more money, and we started building the team. And then, we just kept building and building, and fast forward to kind of 2020. And, things had continued to grow and evolve. And I think by the end of the Super Bowl in 2020, we were like 40 people, 40-ish people. Things were exploding. And then it was that point where we're like, all right, we're really onto something. And then Bill, at that point, Bill and I decided that, mainly Bill, but I mean, he had already invested a whole whack of money. And I was like, all right, now it's time to really put the gas on the fire. But then at the end of, in the spring of 2020, well, we all know what happened, right? In the spring of 2020, the sports world shut down, right? Pandemic hit, right? Mm-hmm. And so here we are, where we know we have something. Bill's committed to investing a bunch more money. We have this big team, and now all of a sudden there's no more sports, right? And we're a daily fantasy sports business reliant on sports to generate revenue.
Yeah.
So I remember the day that the NBA season was canceled was the day before I was supposed to go on my very first vacation that I've had in years, right? Going down to Mexico with my family. I still went on the vacation. And you can still hear me okay?
Yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Awesome. And so, I remember, I'm down in Puerto Vallarta with my family, and Bill and I we're having, we're on Slack and we're texting all these things. And I remember the conversation where, we realized that there was going to be an opportunity.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the rest of everyone in the sports world was stepping back, right? They were like, oh, we're scared. We got to lay off people. We have to stop spending money because who knows when we're going to be able to get back to generating revenue again. And, we decided, and I'll give full credit to Bill, we decided to get aggressive because we were like, man, if we lean in right now, if we start spending money right now when others aren't, we have an opportunity to really break through and create partnerships and create opportunities that wouldn't exist when we were competing against a ton of other folks.
Yeah.
So we ended up, and again, full kudos to Bill. Bill didn't fire anybody, kept paying people full salary. Like I've said this many times. Bill's not only one of the greatest business people, that I've ever met. He's also one of the greatest human beings I've ever met in my life. Anyway, I remember, started talking to a bunch of pro teams because the thing about Monkey Knife Fight is we were pushing the envelope, right? Here's this new style daily fantasy sports, trying to push the line as close to sports betting as we can get without crossing over. And people are like, is that daily fantasy sports? Is that sports gambling? I'm not really sure. So the whole time we're building this brand and getting users, we also wanted to build some credibility and legitimacy for us. One of the best ways to do that is to align ourselves with other reputable folks, right? So I remember so I had conversations with a bunch of sports teams and, ended up, we did a deal. I was, met the incredible people in Milwaukee for the Brewers. And they loved what we were talking about, and they loved it. And we ended up doing our first big deal was with the Milwaukee Brewers. And, I remember the day that we announced the deal, I was on a call with the chief revenue officer, just an amazing guy named Jason Hartland. And I remember Jason, as the press release went out, Jason said to me, you ready? And I was like, for what? He's like, dude, once this press release goes out, you're going to get hit by every single team, every league, because you're spending money when no one else is. And I was like, whatever. Press release went out and got hit by a lot of folks. But what was really exciting about the Brewers is they were really open to creative marketing and really working with us to get, to really activate and engage their fans. And remember, this was at a time when there were no fans in the stadium.
Yeah.
So, I remember, and I was, worked with their incredible head of partnership at the time, guy by the name of Brendan Sullivan, and Brendan, I remember I was sitting on the couch one day and I was thinking about how do we really get our brand out there for your fans? And I was, watching a baseball game and stadiums were empty. And one of my favorite movies is Bull Durham. And, there's a scene in Bull Durham where, a home run hits a bull and the guy gets a free steak, right? So I was like, oh man, that's kind of fun. So I came up with a concept. It was literally Friday night. I'm on the couch watching a Blue Jay game, and I texted Brendan and I was like, hey man, what do you think about putting a bunch of Monkey Knife Fight cutouts in the right field bleachers? And then if a home run hits a cutout, we'll donate $10,000 to the COVID relief fund of the Brewers. And he was like, that's a great idea. Literally, and check this out. I still, and they sent this to me. This was actually one of the cutouts we had in Miller Park. So we had 100 of these in the right field bleachers. Anyway, and we put that and literally the idea came up on Friday, and I think on Tuesday they were being installed in Miller Park. It was amazing. But we got such great buzz out of that. The broadcasters were talking about it. It was super fun. And then we started doing that with a bunch of other major league teams. We put tarps in the outfield, and if you hit the tarp, we'll donate money to your COVID relief fund. And that was great. And then we started doing more partnership deals. We did a deal with AEG, with the LA Kings and LA Galaxy. Like the Monkey Knife Fight logo was in the ice for Kings games. We did a deal with the Miami Dolphins and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We were the official partner of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, like the year they won the Super Bowl, which was super awesome. We really started, and then the coolest deal, the deal that I had the most fun doing, and this was a deal that I worked on for like a year and a half, is we became the official partner of the NFL Players Association, which was crazy. We were the first real money gaming company to ever do a deal with a Players Association. And so, that was pretty exciting. During this whole time, Bill, I guess we decided not to raise money in the spring of 2020 because the world shut down. No one was doing anything. But by the fall, by September, we were like, all right, I think it's time. We should start thinking about raising some money again.
Yeah.
And we spent that fall trying to raise a bunch of money, and had a slew of incredible conversations with some of the biggest private equity and venture capital firms, both in the U.S. and in Canada. And eventually, there was an offer put on the table from Bally to buy Monkey Knife Fight. And in the end of January 2021, Bally acquired Monkey Knife Fight for $90 million. To think that we founded or we launched Monkey Knife Fight September of 2018 and then sold it 2.5 years later for $90 million was that was a good day. That was pretty exciting. That was pretty cool, man. That was pretty cool. And Bally is an incredible company. But I will say at that time when it was happening, Bill C-218 started gaining some momentum. Now, Bill C-218 was the bill that effectively decriminalized single event sports betting. Now, throughout this whole time, from draft day to Monkey Knife Fight, I had been running these U.S. companies. Monkey Knife Fight was a U.S. business. We had been running these companies from Toronto. Like draft day, I'd go to New York, a couple times a month. Monkey Knife Fight was really built virtually, right? Through Slack, through Zoom. But I'd always wanted to build a brand and build a business in Canada. And now finally there was an opportunity where real money gaming, but legal real money gaming, was a possibility in Canada. And so here I am, Monkey Knife Fight had just sold. I had an opportunity to kind of explore the market, and single event sports betting was a possibility now in Canada. Now, PASPA, which was the legislation in the US that allowed for single event sports betting, was repealed in 2018, which then started the growth of single event sports betting first in New Jersey and then into a number of other states across the US. So that ball started really rolling, which is why Monkey Knife Fight was valued as high as it was, because we had a database, right? A database of real money gaming users. Oh, anyway, back to Canada. The opportunity to build a gaming brand here on my home turf, man, that was super exciting. And so, I spoke to a lot of folks and had some incredible conversations with folks in the industry. But PointsBet was, they were so exciting. And PointsBet, Australian founded 2017, launched in the US in 2019, a real challenger brand. And that's something that I've always loved to be a part of, like building challenger brands. And the thing that really got me was the fact that PointsBet owns and controls its entire tech stack. So from a product perspective, man, oh man, it gives PointsBet so much flexibility to be able to customize product for individual regions, markets, locations. And ultimately, I believe that the biggest opportunity in the North American sports gaming ecosystem is around live in-play betting, which is ironic because I started my career in gaming on live in-play fantasy, right? So I've always been a huge believer in in-play. And, the opportunity I was given the opportunity to join PointsBet, to be their first employee in Canada. We've built, one of the other reasons why I was excited about PointsBet is they were dedicated to building a distinct Canadian business. And I became the first employee for PointsBet. I started June 8th of 2021. And, ultimately the market launched April 4th. We were the first operator to get our license. We've done some incredible deals, and we're now over 50 people here in Toronto. It's been an incredible ride, man. And I can't believe I've been talking almost nonstop for over 50 minutes now. So,
oh no, that's great. That's what I have. I'm just here taking notes because there's so many great stuff you're taking down. I'm trying to remember it also, whether it's clips or even just things to kind of remember myself. Like this is what the podcast is all about, right? Where I kind of started just to provide a perspective that it's not always going to be, A to B, right? I know when I was in school, I was I remember I was Googling, hey, like how to get a job in sports. And there's nothing ever so clear. So then I was like, oh, let me just start talking to people. And then once you have these conversations, especially with the podcast, you just realize, oh, hey, like not everyone's going to be a business student, a sports management student. There's people from all different, shapes and sizes where, like you were saying, you're starting in history, then you went, backpacking, then one thing led to another, right? Where, there's so many different things to kind of get into. But one of the things that you just mentioned there, I just got a quick question about, is one of the things that you're interested in PointsBet, was it similar to how with Monkey Knife Fight where you're doing those activations in the right field of the Brewers? Is that something where you're saying that maybe you could potentially do that with like PointsBet, where I don't know, let's say you partner with like MLSE or like the Red Blacks, if I don't know a touchdown goes off, right, then they run over the logo that's on the field. Is that like an activation where, hey, like you get a bonus or something? Is that?
No, it's honestly, I mean, yeah, that's the kind of stuff that we want to do.
Yeah.
And I will say, like, from a Red Blacks perspective, just to give you a taste, like, for the home opener, what's cool about Red Blacks games, obviously you've been to TD Place. What an incredible place to watch a football game, right? Just awesome. And Ottawa is such a great sports town. But for the home opener, I mean, for every Red Blacks game, what we're doing, we have a bunch of branding. We have the PointsBet Sideline Club, for VIPs and stuff. And we have a bunch of other really cool kind of activation pieces. But one of the fun ones is for every halftime, we have a customized halftime bet that gets announced in stadium to the entire crowd. And for the first game, we had Tom Green come and do the announcement and kind of engage with the fans around the bet. Now, Tom Green's one of the biggest celebrities Ottawa's ever had. I mean, he's an amazing guy. So that was super fun. So to your point, the challenge is, the challenge in Ontario is, we're not allowed to induce people to PointsBet. So I can't even say on your podcast that if somebody were to sign up at PointsBet, they would get something. I'm not actually allowed to say that. Mm-hmm. So it's very hard in kind of mass marketing to try and get people to sign up, right? So we have to be more creative. So some of the things that you've been thinking about are absolutely where we're going to take things, right? I mean, we're 3 months in. So things have been pretty crazy since literally the market launched 3 months ago yesterday, right? So some of the things that you alluded to and some of the tactics that we are going to be leaning into will be influenced by some of the things that I learned from Monkey Knife Fight, because I know directly some of the activation tactics that work and don't work, right? But as an example, like for one of our other great partners is ClubLink. Now, ClubLink is one of the biggest golf companies in Ontario. We're doing something called the breakfast ball. So when we activate at golf tournaments, men's days and women's days alongside ClubLink, if you show up at the course, we're going to give you a branded PointsBet breakfast ball, which is effectively a mulligan that you get on your first hole, right? We're going to give that to you because what we want to figure out, what we want to do is we're not just going to be that company that's going to put 30-second commercials on television. That's lazy, right? Yeah. We don't have the pocketbooks of a lot of the other major operators. So what we have to do is we can't outspend people. We have to outthink people, right? We have to out strategize them. And the other piece is we're actually here, right? So we want to get face to face with people and introduce them to the PointsBet brand in as authentic and as fun a way as we can think of. So, the idea that you brought up with and the stuff that I was talking about with Monkey Knife Fight, we're going to take big swings. I mean, our ambassadors that we launched with are the Trailer Park Boys. Now, you don't necessarily think about the Trailer Park Boys when you think about sports gambling. Most companies are using ex-athletes and this and that. No, screw that, man. That's not authentic, right? We want people who actually will get you laughing, but also we want to figure out audiences that we can connect with authentically. And, when it comes to Canada and being Canadian, well, I mean, the Trailer Park Boys have the second longest running show in the history of Canada, right? I mean, the first longest running show is Hockey Night in Canada, right? Yeah. So that's pretty good. That's a pretty good foundation to build a brand on top of, right?
No, absolutely. And to be honest, what you're saying there makes a lot of sense. Where even what I do on the day to day, right? Where whether it's people on the podcast or even when I'm having meetings about partnerships, a lot of the times when they say certain things, I'm trying to break down to understand what the value is, right? Where it's become more and more clear over the last number of years, companies and brands don't want to just slap, logos on the side of grass or on the side of boards or just being like, hey, we're going to give you all this money and just call it from that, right? So finding different ways to have these creative activations, I definitely see that exciting where you're going to start seeing the, people falling off because, I was reading some stats about how much money is being spent, right? Like you're saying on these 30-second commercials or how much marketing money was spent by, I feel like it was FanDuel or DraftKings. Well, I think it was like 900 million or something last year where they're just throwing money at the wall and hoping it sticks. That's not going to last, right? And eventually somebody has to answer for that. So, no, I definitely agree with that. But kind of moving away from that, kind of getting a little more personal again and just kind of relating back to the audience. Honestly, you've had a tremendous ride, right? You're kind of evolving, kind of going with all the things you're different learning. But going back all the way to the beginning, right? You're saying, hey, like, I think I'm going to be a lawyer, but you know what? Let me just go here and try for, rugby for a bit and then, travel Australia. How did you come up with that decision? Because I feel like a lot of the people listening, they're in their 20s, right? So we're not necessarily getting people entering university, but we're having people that are, graduating or young professionals. So how are you, when you're at that crossroads of making that decision, what types of things are you thinking of to help you, move forward and not just go to law school?
Yeah. And let me, caveat all of this, right? Now, I came from I come from a pretty fortunate background that not a lot of people come from, right? I mean, my family, my parents aren't super rich or anything like that, but they were very supportive, right? Mm-hmm. So I had a bit of a, I did well in school, I graduated with a degree in honors, I'm a good person, but the reality is, it's different. Like I'm a believer in, if you don't ask, you don't get. You got to take big swings, all that shit. Like I don't give up. I'm not scared of shit, like to be honest. And the reality is, I mean, not to belabor this point, but I mean, I've also had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma for over 14 years, living with it and working through it and all that. Like, it's just one of those things. Like, my life philosophy is give zero fucks. Like, I don't sweat things that are not massively life-alteringly challenging. Right now, so back when I was, playing rugby or not going to law school and living in Tremblant and taking a swing at film and television, I give full credit and reality is not even full credit. I mean, I couldn't have done that if I had to worry about rent, if I had to worry about food, right? So ultimately, I was in a position where I could take those big swings. Not everybody is in that situation, right? So if you are in a situation where you don't necessarily have to worry about paying rent or eating, and you're passionate about something, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, right? The reality is the biggest thing that if you want to be an entrepreneur, whether you're a content producer or a tech entrepreneur or a conventional business entrepreneur, the one thing that you need to accept at the very beginning is you need to get really good at hearing the word no, right? You are going to hear no and you're going to fail way many more times than you're going to succeed or hear a yes, right? So you need to develop a level of thick skin, right? So, for me, because I didn't have to worry about eating, I was in a position where I was like, fuck it, man. Like, I'm going to take some swings. And, I had the great luxury, even the very first television show concept that I came up with, I was able to raise a little bit of money to do that show. Now, I raised that money from my father's friends. Like, I talked to them, I had to convince them, but ultimately you still have to have the balls, or you have to have the guts, to kind of take a swing, right? If you're nervous about hearing no, then don't be an entrepreneur. Just don't, right? Get a job. That's cool. Like, no disrespect at all if you don't want to risk. Like, I risked and I gambled my entire life, right? Yeah, I've been able to turn it into a success, but I mean, if it wasn't for the support of my parents, and then if it wasn't for the eventual support of my wife, who I met my wife going from Montreal to Toronto to pitch my very first television show. My wife sat down next to me on the train. That's how I met my wife. Wow. And we ended up getting married. She supported me and us while I was still trying to figure things out and building startup and all that. Like, if you don't have a strong support base, it is really hard to take that big swing, right? So I kind of caveat that in all of the advice that I would ever give to someone, because, I have my perspective. I'm biased by me, right? The reality is, I live life very, in a very, I shouldn't say I live life. Like, I've had I've been very fortunate. But you got to take chances, right? So the other kind of, I say give zero fucks, which I think is really important. But I also believe in something that I call harnessing the randomness, right? So what that means is you never know who you're going to meet. You never know what situation you're going to walk into. And because of that, you never know what opportunities are going to arise. So, Christopher and I, we just met. You're hearing things that I say to you. Like, maybe you're going to have a friend that is a good fit for a job at PointsBet, and then you introduce that person to me, and then that person that, like, you never know where conversations are going to go. And that's a bad example. But ultimately, if you put yourself out there, and I don't care, like there's no bullshit with me. I'll put all the cards on the table all the time. I've negotiated some massive, 8-figure deals in my life. And ultimately my negotiating style is here's the straight goods. There's no bullshit here. Right? This is where the deal has to be, or we're not going to do a deal. And eventually either the deal happens or it doesn't. But what I have is my integrity, because I'm never going to fucking lie to somebody. You know what I mean? So ultimately, the idea of keeping yourself open and being open to conversations and people and ideas. I mean, that's how, I have no idea what my life is going to hold 5 years from now. Shit. You look 5 years back, Monkey Knife Fight wasn't even an idea 5 years ago. Right. And now I'm at PointsBet. Right. So things can move pretty quick, and you just need to be comfortable and flexible enough to kind of roll with it, right? But again, if you have to worry about putting food on the table, if you have, whether it's for yourself or for your family, for your kids, well, that changes your ability to take big swings, candidly.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And to be honest, everything you're kind of saying, like, there's a lot of things like that where I was like, hey, like, that's very relevant to some of the ways that I'm trying to think of right now, where, I'm trying to grow this business now, right? Where, I think last week, right, I had a buddy over before we we're going to go out. I think it was actually the night of the home opener for the Red Blacks. And I was like, hey, like, I just got to finish something quickly on the computer. So he was sitting beside me, and we're just going through my outreach, right, on one of my files. And I was going through my rejection, slide or tab. And I just had to add a couple more information to it just to update it so I can, circle back with them. And I was just scrolling. And I don't think until he kind of said it to me, he's like, hey, like, that's a lot of no's. And I was like, oh, wow. I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. And I never really obviously I try to take things away from it, but I was like, oh, wow. Like, yeah, I guess it is a lot of no's. And I just been trying to move forward from it, but I definitely see what you're saying there, where just kind of that alone, obviously it's still a podcast and people are listening, but that's something like that where, I'm trying to move with that, but I definitely see how that's applicable for sure.
Well, that's it, right? You don't ask, you don't get. You got to put yourself out there, or you're not going to, or like, nobody gives you anything in this world, right? 100%. So you got to try and get it, take it.
No, for sure. I think it's something my dad said when I was a kid growing up. He would always just say, squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? So, sometimes people hit me up and they're like, hey, Ellie, how do you get these different guests even just on the podcast, right? And well, it's just a simple LinkedIn message, right? That's how we kind of connected.
LinkedIn is awesome. I love LinkedIn. Holy smokes.
Yeah. No, for sure. And I guess maybe before we kind of wrap it up, like what kind of ways were you kind of, let's say when you're getting to the producer off the record or maybe with the family channel or XYZ, one of the other experiences you're having, what kind of ways were you getting in front of these people, right? Was it because LinkedIn wasn't around then? So what kind of ways were you kind of moving about?
Well, then it was emails, and it was just asking people for I do like to think I'm a bit of a people collector. You know what I mean? Like you grow big networks and you create good relationships, and I'm not shy to ask people for favors when I need favors and stuff, right? So back then it was more like word of mouth and things like that, and asking for email addresses or phone numbers. Now, straight up, LinkedIn is such a powerful tool. I love LinkedIn. I feel bad. I personally feel bad because, a lot of people reach out to me on LinkedIn now, and I'm so busy. Like, I just don't have the time to properly give people the respect that I want to give them on. Yeah, a lot of LinkedIn is noise and spam, like people trying to sell you shit. And, like if anybody ever like sends me a LinkedIn note with like a calendar invite for a meeting that they're pre-booking, I'm like, okay, well, we're never having a conversation. Just a heads up, sales 101. But, I think these days LinkedIn is such an incredible tool. I've left Facebook. I kind of think that platform has become so unbelievably divisive that I just can't stand it. So I like Twitter. I started getting into Twitter a little bit like 6 months ago or 7 months ago. And I really like, I don't have a ton of followers or anything, but I like Twitter. I like it for what it is, So just, I think that there's nothing wrong. Like, there's nothing wrong with reaching out to somebody on LinkedIn or Twitter. What's the worst thing that's going to happen is they're not going to respond, right?
Yeah.
Worst thing that's going to happen. But, the cool thing about LinkedIn is, you could, if there's somebody you want to get in touch with, like if somebody wants to get in touch with me and they're too scared to come directly to me, well, you can click on the people that I'm connected to that they might be connected to, and you can ask somebody to provide an intro. Like that kind of shit's great, right? But yeah, it's such an easy answer for me right now. But man, LinkedIn is really such an incredible tool. It really is, especially, let's face it, people haven't been getting together and socializing over the last few years. So it's not like, you're like, I'm going to go to the bar that I think that guy goes to or that woman goes to, and I'm going to hope to run into them. Like, no, that shit doesn't, yes, it's starting to happen again. Or I'm going to go to that conference and I'm going to, conferences are starting to build up again as well. But yeah, LinkedIn is such a great tool, man. It's just be patient. Like, somebody that reaches out to me, like, be patient, but also don't be scared to pester, right? Like if somebody reaches out to me and I accept I accept most people. And like they write me a nice note and I'll respond, like just keep hammering me, because ultimately my calendar is just crazy town.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense what you're kind of saying there. I'm kind of noticing now it's almost the opposite, where I'm connecting with people on LinkedIn and now I have to maybe start going to places now just to go get beers now, rather, whereas before maybe you get a beer, then connect on LinkedIn, kind of continue the conversation. So no, I definitely get that. Well, obviously, we've had a lot of things to discuss. I'm heading on my third page of notes now, but just to kind of wrap up the podcast here, there are two things that I still like to ask at the end of every podcast, just kind of maybe wrap things up well. So we went through your whole route, and it was an amazing story, right? But what I like to say is I'm going to live till I'm 103 years old. I'm going to have that rocking chair from my grandma's place, and I'm going to be sitting on that and, thinking back to all the good times. And to date, within your career, what's one story so far that stands out that when you're 103 as well, you're going to reminisce about and be like, wow, I can't believe I got to, live that as a professional career?
You know what? That's a really good question, and I'm glad you didn't give me time to think about it. So, well, because it's instinctually. So I'll tell you, like, and I didn't say this on the earlier in the pod. So when Bill Asher and I started building Monkey Knife Fight in July of 2017, This was like before, like, yeah, like I think there was I remember the very first, we had a Skype call with a bunch of people. I think I saw Bill's face for like maybe less than 2 seconds because it was like, there was a bunch of people. So we started building Monkey Knife Fight together in July of 2017. We only met face to face for the first time October of 2019. And he had already put in $8 million, and we had never met face to face. So to think that we built Monkey Knife Fight together, we had never met until then. And the fact that he had agreed and committed to putting all that money in based on just our interaction and his belief that I could build this with him, for him, that to me was, if you were to say that to somebody like 4 years ago, they would have been like, shut up. And ultimately it was 4 years ago, literally, when we were doing it. Like, but because of the pandemic, right, everything changed by way of Zooms and working remote and all that. If before the pandemic started, when that story came out, literally we were living through it, where like we had never met. People were like, what is going on? What are you talking about? You've never met. Now it would be a little bit more believable. But I think that, that just, that's not necessarily like I think that's just an interesting story to tell people, right? Sure. Like, so there's been a lot of things that have happened in my career that are funny, that are kind of insightful. But I think that to me is just one of those like, wow, that's kind of nuts, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. I think probably before the pandemic, it'd be one of those new Netflix docuseries, right? Where rather than Tinder swindlers, it'd be like the LinkedIn swindler, right? Where
there you go,
some man provides $8 million into a company that they never met, right? So
right.
And I guess the last question I'd like to ask. So we went in the future, using something like the DeLorean, going back in time, right? And speaking to 16, 18-year-old Nick, or even, Nick, who's at Tremblant, right? Or in Australia trying to figure out his life. What's one piece of advice that you now know that you wish, a younger version of yourself or myself or anyone listening would know that you think is very impactful?
Save some money. Man, again, that's a really good question. And like, the thing is, this is going to sound, I don't think it's not going to sound cocky, but like, I like what I've done. I like the person I've evolved into. Like, again, like the only, and this is not something that I could have changed. Like, again, like I have non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I've had it for over 14 years. It's not like I could go back to when I was 18 and say, now I have a very specific diet and very specific exercise and all that. But, it's not like I can go back in time. I mean, that's probably what I would do, is I would go back and and I'd tell myself to stop eating so much shitty food and to start exercising more, right? That's probably what I would do. But I mean, if it wasn't for the things that I experienced from the time I was 17 or 18 till now, I wouldn't be the person I am today. And I like who I am. I'm a good person. I have an awesome family. I like how my career's evolved. I mean, yeah, maybe I would have enjoyed, focusing. I would have liked to have, I'd like to think about being a rugby player back then when I was young, but having the experience of being an older rugby player, right? I'd like to bring just that knowledge of how the game actually works to when I actually was young and fast and strong, right? But that's just more of a physical thing and a brain thing. I think when it comes to work, like, yeah, would I have loved to have changed the in-gamer business model so we would have been able to be a success at in-gamer? Sure, but then I wouldn't be doing this right now, and I wouldn't have had the Monkey Knife Fight experience. And yeah, could I have made more money? Sure, but ultimately, I'm really content. I'm happy with where I'm at. I just, it's just the things that I can't control. There's no point in trying to control it, right? So yeah, I think I'd like to be a better rugby player based on the knowledge that I learned, 4 or 5 years after that. Yeah, I'd probably just eat better and take care of myself better. But from a business perspective, I don't think I'd change a thing, to be honest.
Yeah, no, so basically almost just kind of be open to life and, the experiences that kind of come with it. And to be honest, what you're
Totally.
saying about rugby, I kind of feel the same way where, now that I'm not playing anymore, right, you can't compete at NHL or any of that because I'm not talented enough. But I see some things now, I'm like, wow, if I knew that at 12 or 15, I'm like, I think I could have been something special. But I think that's everyone, right? So,
Well, I mean, I'm 5'10" and Jewish, so there aren't too many professional athletes around my
oh,
size and stature. So, hey,
yeah, yeah.
but
Uh,
you have
of course, yeah.
aspirations to be bigger and better.
Yeah, yeah. I'm 5'6" in Portuguese. I was never made for the ice. But
There you
yeah,
go.
that's good stuff. Well,
But
now
you
let's
were
do
made for marketing and for podcast creating. So there you go, buddy.
apparently so. Apparently so. I thought I was going to be an accountant, and as soon as that took place, I was like, yeah, this isn't for me. So happy where things kind of shaped out to be. But yeah, no, this has been an amazing episode. Like I said, I'm always taking notes during these podcasts, and it's always a good sign when there's, scribbling everywhere all over my pages. So I really appreciate you coming on, taking the time. I know you're busy, but unless there's anything else you'd like to share, thank you so much. And yeah, hopefully we can stay connected.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Christopher. And remember, everybody, download PointsBet. We have the best live betting product in the North American gaming space. So if you live in Ontario, download PointsBet. Right? Gotta stay on brand a little bit, right?
Absolutely, you have. You gotta, shameless plug whenever needed. So yeah. Well,
There
that's
you
it
go.
for episode 101 of The Route. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, subscribe, follow, all the good stuff there, and see you guys next week. And that's a wrap for this week's episode.